What's going on, guys? So I am really glad that I made those videos talking about towing a relatively light travel trailer, typically 6,500 pounds or less, with a relatively heavy-duty pickup truck, whether it's going to be an F350 single rear wheel, a 3500 HD, a 3500 Ram, or 4500 series Ram, or a 5500 series, or an F450 or an F550. Basically, trucks that have very stiff rear suspension. I think a lot of people kind of came away from those videos with a different perception on the type of shock that can be transferred to the front A-frame section of a trailer. And I think a lot of people are kind of learning some things that they didn't really think about, or at least they're starting to understand how some of the shock from a very stiff rear suspension can translate to potential damage to a front A-frame section of a trailer. Now, for those of you who are already lighting up the comments saying you don't know what you're talking about, I've been towing like this forever, that's good. That's great. I'm glad that you haven't experienced any issues. But there are so many folks in the comment section who actually had the exact opposite experience and say, yes, this has caused major frame issues every time I have done long-term towing of a small, lightweight travel trailer with a heavier duty pickup truck. A lot of people even comment on the fact that people with HDTs, heavy-duty trucks, big tractors, that tow these huge RVs, right, that they have also seen and heard of experiences where people have had frame issues and steel issues whenever you mix really, really stiff suspension with relatively light-duty trailers. So let's talk about that, but more importantly, I'm going to address the questions so many people ask me when it comes to a setup like this, and if they should add airbags, and if airbags are going to fix their problems, or even timbrins or sumo springs, things like that. Let's talk about that. Hang tight. I'll be right back. Okay, so first and foremost, to understand the answer to this question, you have to understand what airbags and sumo springs or timbrins actually do when you add them to a truck like this. What are their intended purpose? So what a lot of people probably don't realize is that when you add airbags to a truck that's already equipped with leaf springs and all you're doing is adding airbags or adding timbrins or adding sumo springs, you're basically adding something that is going to reduce the amount of travel before some type of suspension component comes into play, whether it's the timbrin, whether it's a sumo spring, whether it's an airbag. Airbags, of all of them, are really the only active form of mitigating that travel. Basically what I mean by that is when you throw airbags in a truck, any truck, all their intended purpose really is to mitigate how much travel the truck can start to experience before that suspension component comes into play. So adding airbags to this truck or my previous truck when I had airbags on that, or the truck before that with airbags, the intent was never to increase the payload carrying capacity, because that's not what they do. The intent is that the truck doesn't squat as much, that if you're going to put a heavy amount of weight, such as the 3,600 pounds worth of fifth wheel weight, into the bed of your truck, and you're going to press down where your headlights might normally be pointing up into traffic because your truck's squatted now, the airbags simply level the load out. It levels your truck out, it brings the suspension back up, and it allows your headlights to point back down at the road, and in some cases, it's going to give you a bit more feeling of control from the front suspension. In most cases, it won't, because airbags do not act as weight distribution systems. They do not distribute weight from the back of your truck to the front of your truck. Now, what airbags can certainly do from a trailer perspective, if I level out the front of my truck and all of a sudden the back of my trailer is leaning down, I can absolutely shift weight around the axles of the RV if there's two axles. I can for sure put more weight towards the back axle than the front axle. That's why it's imperative, regardless of if you have airbags or not, that when everything is set up, your trailer is as level as possible and you've properly distributed the load inside of your RV so it's balanced properly. So you're not putting too much in the back, you're not putting too much in the front. Basically, you have it leveled out so about 10 to 15% of the trailer's gross weight, the loaded weight, is transferring to the back of your tow vehicle. That is pretty much to ensure that you're at least balancing the load, so a little bit more is on the back of your vehicle, which gives you more control from a towability perspective. So the question people asked on that video, from a shock reduction perspective, if I have airbags on my truck, Is that going to reduce the amount of shock that the front A-frame section of the trailer is going to experience? And the answer to that is it could slightly, but most likely it's not going to do anything, and it could actually make things worse, because what you're doing at that point is you're limiting the ability for the suspension to actually bend and articulate the way it's supposed to. So if I were to completely rip out the leaf spring suspension from this truck and replace it with like a Kelderman system or a liquid spring system that switches from leaf sprung suspension to some form of airbag or hydraulic suspension, then yes, I can absolutely make that suspension softer in the back, so whenever we go over bumps, it's more of a floating feel to the front A-frame section of the trailer. If I simply add airbags to this truck using like an airlift or a Firestone system, then all I'm doing in essence is creating pressure between the top of the leaf springs or the frame and the axle to lift up the trailer. And by adding airbags, all I'm essentially doing at that point is leveling out the back of the truck. It's not necessarily creating a softer, smoother ride. Now, because the airbag itself, the cushion, is going to engage before the leaf springs do, that's where you might get a little bit of shock absorption to the frame section of the trailer. But it's going to be minimal. It's not going to be a lot, and it's certainly not going to be enough to probably reduce the overall amount of stress that's being transferred to the trailer. Now, some folks are going to say, well, you're sponsored by Shocker, or because they sell through eTrailer, this is, just your way of trying to sell their product. I personally don't care which product you get. I just recommend having a shock absorbing hitch that's going to reduce some of the shock that transfers to the front A-frame section of your trailer. Shocker, Gen Y, CURT, what are these other brands? AirSafe. None of these companies sponsor me. Yes, eTrailer carries a bunch of them, and that's the reason why I was able to give you that really comprehensive kind of review of how each one functions, the amount of shock that you're going to see inside of the vehicle and at the back A-frame section of your trailer in those previous videos I did. But the reality of this is, regardless of who you get the hitch from, any shock absorbing hitch that is actually functioning and it's actually giving you shock absorption in this area is likely going to reduce the amount of stress that travels to the front A-frame of your trailer. A way that I kind of felt like trying to figure out how I could test this not theory, I think this is all factual actually, but the way I thought was if I took a really thinned boxed section of steel and I put wheels on it and I put a bunch of weight towards the center of it and I towed it around without a shock absorbing hitch using a standard hitch, at what point would the weight cause that thin piece of steel to buckle? And if I used a suspension style hitch, at what point would it then buckle, if it would buckle at all? So the visual here I want you to think about is, again, regardless of if we have airbags that have been added to the suspension here, are those airbags actually going to prevent the shock that the truck's going to experience, or are they simply going to level out the back of the truck? But the thing to think about here is, okay, I have the A-frame section hooked to the back of the truck. I hit a big bump, and I don't have any shock absorbing hitch that moves here, which means the trailer is going to follow the suspension of the truck, especially if it's a lighter duty trailer. If it's, only transferring 400, 500, 600 pounds to the truck, it's going to jar with the truck like this every time the truck hits a bump, because it's not going to be compressing the suspension enough to really allow the suspension to give you that cushier ride that a 3/4 ton truck or even some 1 ton trucks are going to have. With a suspension hitch in place, it's going to do this number. It's going to bounce with the airbag or whatever suspension mechanism is in place, and it's going to cause the frame section here not to go like this, but to go like this. And to me, it's just logic. It's common sense that a suspension style hitch will actually do less damage and can prevent damage from being done to your A-frame. Again, for those of you who asked about airbags, I don't think that they will help you that much. They might help a little bit, but I don't think they're going to help that much, because you're essentially adding pressure to an area that right now can freely move. And that's the key, especially when you're hauling a light trailer. That's what this whole thing is about. Not super heavy trailers, but lighter trailers. Anyways, guys, light up the comment section, because I think because of these videos that I've produced, there's been more thought around this topic than there ever has been in the past, and that's a good thing. Whether or not you agree or disagree, and I think most people would agree, especially if you read the comments, it's kind of crazy. The vast majority of people are like, wow, I didn't think about that. That is a really, really good thing to think about. And there were a few going, well, you're just sponsored by the shock absorbing hitch companies, which is totally not the truth. To be honest with you, My Gen Y Mega Hitch, that super beefy hitch, I'd rather see on the back of my truck. I think it looks cooler. I think it gives me more kind of universal capabilities to do different things, from recovery to be able to handle heavier trailers than this is capable of handling. But then every time I'm about to take this one off to throw the Gen Y back on, I'm like, you know what? We haul this trailer around quite a bit, and the last thing I want to do is cause any type of damage, so I'll just keep this on here. I could always throw the Gen Y Boss on. The problem is, again, with these lighter trailers, I'm just not transferring enough weight to the Boss to actually allow that torsion flex system to come into play. So again, this is one of those areas where you got to kind of understand what you're working with here and realize what might actually be impacting your trailer, especially things on the inside that could be breaking apart or falling apart because of the amount of shock that's being transferred to the trailer. Now, Gen Y does make a lighter duty version than both of the ones I have, which has like a 10,000 pound capacity with like a 1,000 pound tongue weight capacity, and something like that would probably be perfect for a trailer like this. Anyways, guys, I sure hope you enjoyed this video. If you haven't had a chance, please take a moment, drop a comment below, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and we'll talk to you again very soon.